Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Welcome back for another episode of the Everything Compliance Award winning Everything Compliance podcast. Today, we're going to take up a single topic, and that is the Boeing guilty plea, what it may mean. We're joined by the quartet of Jonathan Marks, Karen Moore, Jonathan Armstrong, and Matt Kelly. We're going to start off with Karen Moore, who is traveling the world with her better half, but has joined in for this episode. So, Karen, first of all, welcome. And what are you thinking about these days about Boeing?
Ooh, so much, Tom. It's kind of hard to stop thinking about Boeing. We've got this plea deal. I was kind of hoping for prosecution, I have to say, a little bloodthirsty. Part of me was hoping that we'd see this dragged out in court, but no, we've got a plea deal, which I guess the court can still refuse to accept, but it still contains no disgorgement. I just want to remind everybody that the estimated annual profit on the sale of the 737 Max before the two disasters was about 10 billion a year. So in the light of that, another few hundred million in penalties doesn't seem like a huge fine, but still, we still aren't seeing any executive prosecution, although the DOJ hasn't ruled it out. It said that it is only talking now about this corporate action, so we may still see something. The rumor mill is that they're going to get to keep their government contracts, which they may normally be disbarred from, so that may be an exception. 37% of their revenues in 2023, so it would be a pretty big deal if they were precluded from doing that. I'm sure there's been some behind doors dealing there, and sure they've got some knock-on effect as a result of this plea deal in terms of, I suppose, ability to get financing. Their share price, bidding will have to factor in costs, etc. I also wanted, before I dive into my real soapbox topic of the day, just wanted to point out that a lot of people are saying that this whole problem arose out of big changes in the culture, which arose out of the merger of Boeing and McDonnell Douglas in the late 90s. So it's just a great cautionary tale out there for people not doing sufficient due diligence and planning for culture in acquisition integration. So, topic for another day, but I think this is turning out to be one of those examples that's had a long-reaching negative effect. But what I really wanted to talk about today, because I've been thinking about it so much, is the type of a bigger picture. We talk a lot about corporate purpose, we talk about corporate responsibility, we talk about corporate culture. And in the light of all three of those, I'm going to talk a little bit more about corporate identity. When we talk about corporate purpose, there's the big discussions of the spectrum between shareholder primacy and stakeholder capitalism. And I think that the pendulum swings back and forth depending on the economy and political circumstances and societal demands. But it's clearly not a corporate purpose only to generate profit for a shareholder, but it can also be a corporate purpose to satisfy all the vast number and population of stakeholders out there. So we have to think about that. CSR, corporate social responsibility, has also been bandied about quite a bit. What does a corporation owe to society at large, regardless of the footprint and accountability it has for its direct operations? And then more and more, we're talking about corporate culture and the importance of corporate culture. But we don't really talk about corporate identity. And by that, I mean what is often expressed as core values of a company, but to me really has to go to the heart of who are we as a corporation? What are our immutable, unshakable, uncompromisable values that will cause us to make our decisions not necessarily for the immediate profitability of the company or its shareholders or its executives. And I want to talk about that because I think that Boeing, if it is going to get out from under this mess it finds itself in, cannot just pay several hundred million in fines, cannot just work with a bunch of corporate monitors, and the monitorship is an incredibly important addition here. I don't want to discount that. Cannot just spend 400 odd million on a compliance program, it has got to do some introspection at the very highest level to say, who are we really? Because when you find the core values on the Boeing website, and they're actually not that easy to find, I think their mission statement is hidden under sustainability, but fair enough, they're there. Their core values are safety, quality, integrity. If they're committed to that as their corporate identity, then those things have to permeate the organization at all levels. It needs to be reflected in every stakeholder relationship that they have. And I think that this is where they really failed entirely. We see companies with corporate identities get it right and corporate identities that get it wrong. I would like to speak up for Philip Morris, which, you know, is, as an evil tobacco company, does produce a product that kills millions of people annually. However, I can say that in the time that I was there, from the very top to the very bottom of that organization, youth smoking prevention was absolutely a core value of that company. There was everything that could be done to try and stop people underage from smoking, including trying to get age restrictions on the sale of tobacco in companies. I can say when I was part of the corporate side of the law department, rather the compliance side of the law department, how many marketing meetings I had to attend because the lawyers reviewed every piece of marketing material down to the Marlboro matchbox to make sure that it wouldn't be attractive to children. So it was a core value, and that's something that's actually transformed into harm reduction in that company. And nobody really seems to talk about that. A company that only has one product under various trademarks, but only one product, is now telling people, please do not buy that product because we believe we have a better, safer product out there. We want you to stop smoking conventional cigarettes and start using heat not burn, which is, by the way, not an aerosol product, heat not burn product, which we believe will reduce harm. So something that, right or wrong, however you feel about the product, the company really so firmly believes that everything it does gets centered around that. You see a company like Chick-fil-A, for example, which, because of its core beliefs, does not sell its very, very popular chicken sandwiches on a Sunday. They are closed on a Sunday because they don't believe people should be engaged in a commercial activity on what they view as a sacred Sabbath day that is not dedicated to work. So whether you believe in what they do, whether you like their sandwiches or not, you have to respect that this is something that they're consistent about and willing to forego profit in order to stay consistent to their core value. We also see, besides Boeing, what happens when you get it wrong. And there's been a lot of discussion recently about Tractor Supply, which is a Fortune 500 company. Which has now eliminated all the DEI roles in the company. It has stopped sponsoring any kind of pride activities. It has withdrawn its carbon emissions goals, all in response to what it has perceived as a very conservative customer base. It's made all these statements, all these commitments that really weren't part of its core, weren't part of the way that it works with its customers, and now they have to withdraw from them. And as we all know, taking back something that you've said you believe in is really is a difficult thing. And I don't want to call it Tractor Supply specifically, because, Tom, I think we could have a whole other week discussion about how companies are backing off from their DEI commitments. But it is just an example of, if you don't know who you are, you're not going to be able to create a sustainable business, and it will come back to bite you. So when we talk about Boeing and we talk about the safety, quality, and integrity, I just question how they can possibly say that those are part of their immutable core values when they have lied to their regulator, the FAA. They have bowed to the bottom line by pushing out the 737 MAX in response to competition from Airbus in an effort to make sure that American Airlines did not purchase from Airbus due to delays in 737 MAX production. They knowingly put a faulty system with insufficient training into aircraft. I would like to say what's even worse, I only just recently discovered that depending on what you paid as an airline, you got a faultier system than you might have if you paid more. And in that relation, that was the Wall Street Journal reporting that American Airlines paid a little extra so that when this MCAS system, if it didn't engage properly, a light would go on in the cockpit even before takeoff, and the pilots would have a chance to address it then and there. Lion Air, Ethiopian Air did not pay extra. Their pilots say that they had little or no training. There's almost no mention in the manuals, and there was certainly no visible cockpit light. So this company that has caused 356 people to fall from the sky has not retained a commitment to safety, quality, and integrity, and is not prioritized stakeholders. And that's really the last comment I want to make. A company cannot satisfy the vast pool of stakeholders that you've got out there. It's got to prioritize this concept that your shareholders are your most important stakeholders. I say phooey to that, because the shareholders, the reason we have so many securities regulations is so that the investing public should go in knowingly into a company, into what the company does, into what the company believes in, should be able to rely on that, should be able to understand that they may need to forego immediate profits in the interest of long-term sustainability and the company being true to itself. In any event, shareholders are largely institutional investors in this country, so they shouldn't be going in blind to that. The board also really is supposed to be representing those shareholders and directing the company. So when you're talking about important stakeholders, I'd like to propose that for any company, but especially a company like Boeing, you've got three really big important ones. One are your third parties. What's your supply chain relationship looking like? Do you have too many suppliers? Because that's caused them some problems in different parts of their business, so that you're not controlling them, you're not developing the relationships you should. Another, for me, really important group is your employees. And here, clearly, they have failed to engage their employee base to make them feel that if you've got safety, quality, and integrity as your three really clear core values identifying who you are, that those employees did not feel that they were committed to safety, that they were committed to quality, or that they were committed to integrity, that they were protected in any way, that they were encouraged to speak up if they had problems, that they were working for a company that was being honest and truthful and transparent, that was willing to forego short-term profitability in the interests of their commitment to safety, quality, and integrity. And then the third group, I would argue, besides third parties and employees, that's really important for a company like Boeing, which is producing, planes that are worth millions of dollars, is the consumer, not the customer. The airlines, important for them for sure, but what about the consumer, the people who are actually flying in those airplanes? A lot of us do not have any choice. I flew here to England on a Boeing jet. I'm probably going to be flying on a Boeing jet to Norway tomorrow, but the consumer is somebody that Boeing needs to pay a little bit more attention to and care if 356 of them fall out of the sky due to their own fraudulent activity. So corporate identity, core, unshakable, uncompromising beliefs that permeate the organization, I think, is, my opinion, Boeing's starting point on a new day one.
Well, Karen, I think there's lots and lots of comments, and I'm going to pitch it over to Mr. Marks because he has comments galore for us.
Well, I guess, Karen, my big question here is, and I see this all the time, and it's not necessarily embedded in Boeing, but you bring up some really fascinating points about culture and all that kind of good stuff. I'm a big root cause guy. I'm going back to accountability. I'm going back to, if there's something broken and I'm putting a remediation plan in there, who's holding those people accountable? Who's checking on them? I think too often than not, and I see this over and over and over and over and over again, somebody goes in, they fix something, and there's absolutely no follow-up. Or the follow-up is so poor that they're just pulling the wool over people's eyes. And so, I think in order for us to kind of move forward from all of this, and if you're going to put in these remediation steps, no matter what they are, and granted, there's a whole host of issues here that we can certainly unpack, and I have tons of comments related to them, but I still go back to the fundamentals, and that is, where's the board? How come they're not being proactive? How come they're not asking the questions? And then where is internal audit, or where is management following up on all this stuff and holding people accountable? If you're going to put a remediation plan in place, there should be some follow-up. You develop new controls. Those controls should be tested shortly thereafter to make sure that they're not only designed appropriately, but they're effective. That's what Sarbanes-Oxley was all about. So to me, I'm with you. I thought they were going to get a bigger slap on the wrist, yet to be determined. Maybe they should be relegated to eat their own meals from American Airlines or the American Airlines meals for the next 2 years. That would be a great punishment for them. But I'm going to turn this over to the rest of my colleagues because I know they're chomping at the bit.
Mr. Armstrong, what you got for us?
Yeah, I was just going to echo Jonathan M's comments about board composition. I know it's a bit of a hobby horse with me at the moment, but boards do need to be truly diverse, and that's not just diverse on gender and origin, and that's important, but also skills. And I had a quick look at the Boeing board. It seems to be fairly significantly customer focused, and Karen's absolutely right, drawing a distinction between customers and consumers. I'm not saying that we pack the board with, it becomes the highest status of frequent flyer that you exceed platinum and you get a seat on the board of Boeing. But I think there needs to be people with a compliance background, people with a safety background, and they didn't jump out to me as much as the retired purchasers of Boeing kit, whether that be civil or military, jumped out to me on the current board. And equally, I think corporate America, speaking as whatever my current title is, the representative of the ancient regime over the Atlantic, who knows better. But corporate America does have a problem with boards being incestuous. And, I'll be on your board if you'll be on mine. And oftentimes I think scandals are related to that. You turn a blind eye to my scandal and I'll turn a blind eye to yours. So we need more independence on boards. And that needs to be independence of thought, and it needs to be independence of skills as well. So we don't need to duplicate auditors, no disrespect to Mr. Marks, so that we have a board full of auditors. We need to have a board who can truly assess risk and hold the executives to account.
Matt, I'm sure you have something for us.
Well, actually, a lot of what I had been thinking about as Karen was giving her remarks, both Jonathans sort of captured them already. Although I am thinking a bit about what does Boeing actually have to do to rectify its situation. And so, Karen, when you said fairly that companies cannot be all things to all stakeholder groups, I do agree that's true, but you can be all things to some. And one of the most important would be one of the ones Karen mentioned, which is the employees. And a lot of Boeing's problems seem to be that it was not doing enough for its employees who were trying to tell upper management, things are wrong, things are not safe, we should slow down. And they were not hearing, or they were not listening to these employees trying to say this. And this is not news that at most companies, most employees, most of the time, they want to speak up solely because they want to see the company succeed. So the raw material is there to have a good company and a good corporate culture. And really, and as I've heard on many different webinars and many different compliance officers, the challenge is not the speak up culture because employees are speaking. It is that management is not listening. And so if I am looking for the sort of things that will need to happen over the next 3 to 5 years to get Boeing into a better place, it's going to be a lot of that. It's going to be a lot of how does senior management really build effective listening cultures, I guess a culture at the higher level, not even at the lower level, because I think the culture at the lower level was pro-safety, but the culture at the upper management was not pro-listening to questions about safety. That's what they're going to have to do, whether that is better internal reporting hotlines or better training, or frankly, different people at the top and on the board. Like that's one of the things that's going to happen here.
Karen, there's a lot that got pitched at you. What do you have kind of in response or observations of the comments?
Yeah, well, first, I think great comments. Agree with them all. Just one small point in defense of the board. Not that they deserve a lot of defense. My understanding on the facts is that the 737 MAX got pushed out before the board approved the design. And apparently there's some mechanism by which the board has some sort of involvement in the design. Although I think, Jonathan Armstrong was right on the mark where I'm not really sure the board had the capacity or the expertise to really say something about it. But it did get pushed out before. But I do think that, what we saw in one of my favorite pieces of Caremark exposition in the motion to dismiss decision, the Boeing board was told, you have got to understand what are your mission critical risks and deal with them. And mission critical is safety. It's in their core values, but it's just by definition on the type of things that they are producing, that safety has got to be mission critical. So while I agree 100% with Jonathan Marks, where was the board and where was internal audit? 100%. I also say, where was the ability to say that there were people on the factory floor and in those design studios and in the pilot aviation testing group who really felt comfortable saying, whoa, wait a minute, something is not right and we need to do something about it, and not only felt comfortable in their careers and their jobs, but really felt like this was part of their pride in the company. I get back to that corporate identity that I owe it to this company, to Matt's point, that you've got employees that are committed to a high quality product. You should be so proud to work for Boeing, that this is a positive thing. This is not just an obligation, but I am helping this company by speaking up and saying, I see a problem here that needs to be addressed, and then having confidence that somebody's going to do something about it.
Mr. Marks.
Plumbing. So Matt, you kind of hit it on something that I was sort of in tune with this week, only because I spent the entire week in Trinidad and Tobago, which, by the way, if you've never been, is a interesting place to be. I had my first doubles while I was there. So if you don't know what that is, I could tell you later, but it was pretty yummy and the people were awesome. But more importantly is plumbing. So one of the things that this organization that I did compliance training for this week did was they replumbed their pipes so that, you're right, people are not, they are speaking up, but they were definitely afraid, much like you had mentioned, that those people that were saying things, those things were dying on the vine. And so now they've rerouted certain pipes so that information, that feedback, which we all know is ultra critical in order to enhance the compliance program, goes to folks that can actually route it to the right place. So it doesn't go into the sewer or it doesn't get flushed, meaning that management is not part of that routing. It's basically an independent group that is holding management accountable for that and then reporting to the board. I think that's ultra critical for what we're doing today. And I think that's one of the reasons why, and I keep reading all about Boeing, much like all of us, is that, I can't believe in an organization like that, somebody didn't complain. Somebody didn't say something. Of course, somebody said something. Of course, somebody complained, but it died on the vine. And that's very, very common because people are afraid that they're going to look at them as incompetent, or they may expose something, or they may, thwart some bigger initiative that really might not be generally kosher. And so plumbing, and I'm interested to hear everybody's comments about that.
Anyone have a plumbing comment?
Yeah, I'm going to have a school uniform comment. So my husband teaches at a school which has a school uniform requirement, and it's slowly but surely over the last few years that school uniform requirement has not been enforced. And so the kids are coming in every which way. And I said, this is dangerous. I warned him, because once you say, I'm not going to enforce the school uniform policy, people don't believe that you're going to enforce any other policy as well. So I don't doubt that Boeing's got some good procedures in writing and some good speak up culture platforms that it has tried to implement. But once you fail in one place, you fail across the board, or you run the risk of falling across the board.
All right. Well, we're going to move over to Matt. What have you been thinking about in terms of Boeing this week, Matt?
Well, Tom, I have been thinking a lot about, like I had mentioned earlier, sort of the practical steps that have to happen now. So Boeing is pleading guilty, and it is doing that because it already had a deferred prosecution agreement that now has been violated because of other misconduct. So that deferred prosecution got brought back onto the front burner, and they are pleading guilty. They're paying fines, they're getting a monitor, and I believe they're getting a 3-year probation deal. So before we get even into some of the other what do they have to do stuff, I do have a question, and Tom, I don't know if you or anyone else can answer this, but so what happens if Boeing is now found in next year, the year after, to have yet more misconduct? Because I don't think that's far-fetched, but there's no longer any deferred prosecution to bring forward. It has been brought forward. So we do what exactly? Has it been found in violation of its probation? Is there a new investigation and a new prosecution for new misconduct? Like, do we actually know what happens when the next shoe drops?
So we have had a 3-time recidivist under the FCPA, and obviously that was ABB. And my guess here, Matt, would depend on Boeing's response. If they identify conduct that violates the probation agreement going forward, and bring that forward and show they've done a root cause analysis and show they put a remediation plan in place, there's probably going to be lesser of a sanction. If it turns out that they're hiding information or planes fall out of the sky because of a airline cannot buy the safety upgrade to tell them when something's wrong, I think the punishment will be a little bit harsher. The problem is we can't afford to debar Boeing.
No.
Boeing has to be able to manufacture military, commercial airlines, spaceships, and be a big part of the U.S. economy. So we have to craft something that will punish them, and I suspect it would be greater oversight.
And the next question I have, which I think the answer so far is we do not yet know, but when Boeing does actually settle this case and prosecutors release any sort of settlement deal, which I don't think they have, I think this is still pending court approval, but will this new deal require the CCO and the CEO to certify the effectiveness of the compliance program at the end of their probation period? Because let's remember, when Boeing first signed its original DPA in 2021, that certification, that wasn't a thing. So that wasn't part of the original DPA. And now we're going to have this new probation term. Does that get included? I suppose we'll have to wait and see. And I still have mixed feelings about CCO certifications, because I do think it puts a compliance officer in a very potentially difficult position. Because what if, you then find out that actually there was still more misconduct somewhere along the way during the probationary period, and that doesn't come to light until afterwards? Does the CCO face any sort of personal liability? And we still don't know an answer to that question, because nobody has signed any of these yet, because they're still so new, although they'll start signing them, I think, by the end of this year. So, I think a lot about, ideally, since the CCO and CEO are signing that certification together, that should lead the CEO to have a very productive and supportive relationship with the chief compliance officer at Boeing or anywhere else. That would be the ideal. However, I do wonder if in practice, this still might somehow lead the CEO to try and hang any potential future bad news on the neck of the CEO. It's one of these hypotheticals that we don't yet know what that means. I mean, I heard stories of misconduct coming out, and management tries to blame the CCO because we had the misconduct. You were in charge of compliance. It didn't work. This must be your fault. I've heard that a lot, and I'm sure a lot of listeners have, but we haven't heard that. And there was this CCO, CEO certification liability hanging above everybody's head. How's that going to work? Yet again, we don't know. But the other thing that I also have been thinking about is this part about A, there's going to be a monitor, and B, I presume there will also be extra reporting from Boeing to the Justice Department, like these interim reports, which seem to be very much in vogue now with the Justice Department. And so, again, what would we actually think would be in those reports? Well, probably you're going to be reporting on some tangible progress that you are making on planned compliance program improvements, and give them regular status updates, whether that's every quarter, every year, or whatnot. Effectiveness of your compliance program, and then any new issues that you may have discovered. And you want to, as Tom, to your point, like cough those up early rather than cough them up later because you've been hiding them. So I have no idea if that's exactly what Boeing would have to report to Justice. It just seems those are the most sensible things, and that's what I've seen in other arrangements and other settlements. So, if compliance officers are kind of thinking about what would this mean for me if I were in Boeing's shoes, well, you'd have to be thinking about how would you actually assure timely progress on whatever compliance remediation program you have. As fate would have it, we have an example of that in the news from a very different corner of the corporate world, where Citibank just this week was slapped around by banking regulators for dragging its feet on improvements it was supposed to make per a consent order from 2020, when Citibank paid $400 million and made all sorts of promises that absolutely double quick they were going to make improvements to their data quality, internal controls, risk management. Here we are 4 years later, that has not happened. And so the banking regulators came back and slapped another $136 million penalty on Citibank. But B, they had also implemented a new requirement that Citibank will now have to go through a new quarterly progress called a resource review plan that will have to be approved by the board. And that resource review plan is going to be going through that every quarter to make sure, are we making progress on our targets? Or if we have not, what targets are falling behind? And I could easily see some sort of thing like that in a Boeing arrangement, either with Boeing specifically or maybe some other company some future day. But when we wonder, what are these interim reports you're making to the Justice Department or the Monitor? I suspect it will be something like that. Or I suspect that you on your own as a company would want to develop a process like that, rather than have regulators tell you to, which is what happened with Citibank. But, there would be things like that. And then I was also thinking a lot about, you want to report on the effectiveness of your program. Well, what would effectiveness be? You'd be looking at metrics like case closure times. Are they getting better? Or are they getting better per type of issue? Because I get that some issues can be closed faster than others. Unaddressed internal audit findings, and there's some red meat for Jonathan Marks, because I also think one great way to look at the effectiveness of your program and your corporate culture is to see what internal audit findings that say need attention don't get attention, because clearly that means board and senior management are not saying, why haven't these been fixed? Get them fixed now. So if you see a big pileup of unaddressed audit findings, that to me raises serious questions about culture and the effectiveness of the compliance program. Maybe reports of retaliation. I get it that violations happen, especially to big, complicated business like Boeing. Compliance violations are a fact of life, but reports of retaliation are not. Those are a choice. Somebody is choosing to retaliate against a manager. So incidents of retaliation, I think, are more serious and a better indicator of your program's effectiveness or lack thereof than just regular sort of routine compliance violations. Compliance violations will always be with us, but retaliation does not have to be with you. Somebody is choosing to retaliate, and if that's a persistent problem, that's a effectiveness and a culture issue. So those are some of the ideas I've been thinking about how do we get from here where we are to 2027 or 28, when this allegedly will all wrap up. That's what's been on my mind.
Mr. Marks, have a comment for Mr. Kelly.
Yeah, Matt, is it as simple? It might be as simple as, having a dialogue with the chief compliance officer and the chief audit executive, maybe not from an audit committee member, but from the board chair, saying, hey, Mr. Audit Committee, Chief Audit Committee person, are you seeing everything that you're putting forth, being taken care of? And Mr. Compliance person, if that's not happening, how does that impact the organization? I see there needs to be some more connectivity, based on all of this. I mean, Tom, I remember a long time ago, Tom, and maybe you too, Matt, I'm sure you were involved in this, but Tom had this aha moment when it came to COSO and internal controls and compliance. And, I see that, you see internal audit sitting in a box, you see compliance sitting in a box. We all agree everybody should communicate and collaborate. But then I go, okay, fine. Well, how does this really work, or how should it work? And if Karen mentioned some functions of the board. The board has two main functions: one, to provide strategic oversight and to strategic guidance, and two, to provide oversight and monitoring. That's their two key functions. But it doesn't mean that they sit on their heels and wait for people to come to them. They have to be proactive in their monitoring. And I'm saying to myself, if I'm sitting on a board, I'm bringing those two folks into an executive session, and I'm asking them in front of each other, hey, Mr. Auditor, you have findings. Are those findings being remediated properly? And if not, why not? Hey, Mr. Compliance Person, how does that impact our compliance program? And what are we doing about all this? And I don't know whether you take that out of the audit committee sort of, because to me, it's sort of, I don't know that it gets caught up in there. I'm trying to figure this out from an overall governance perspective too, because, I think Boeing is really sort of ignited a fire amongst all of us to kind of relook at a bunch of things. And to your point, Matt, I mean, I read the stuff that was going on at Citi, and I'm just scratching my head.
I mean, I think the sad part is probably a lot of people at Citi have been scratching their head for 4 years too. It's
I know.
It's just like, how do these things not get done? And I get it that Boeing and Citibank are large, complicated organizations. It's not easy to get things done, but you should be able to get something done within 4 years. And Citibank spends roughly $12 to $13 billion on technology every year. And the CEO has said that transformation is going to be a big part of her plan. That was one of the first points she made 3.5 years ago when she took over. That improving regulatory compliance was going to be Citi's top priority. It hasn't worked. Well, why not? And I think those are very similar questions that Boeing's top leaders and board will have to think about too.
Karen, you have a comment or question?
I do have a question, Matt, for you, just your thoughts, because, as I was looking at what comprised the plea deal, we've got the fine, but everything else is on compliance, right? So here you have to spend money, you're going to have a monitor, and we'll see obviously how the monitor how that's put in place, but it feels like so much is being put on the compliance program, almost like a or an unbalanced view of how you're going to fix this. That is, that there's this concept that the chief compliance officer and the monitor and all this money are somehow going to fix a problem that really needs to devolve to the board and executive leadership. I mean, what take do you have on that?
Well, I mean, at some point, somebody has to take point on this. So I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea that the compliance officer is the one who takes point. But question number one, will the chief compliance officer have the proper stature in the company? I see that the current compliance officer for Boeing is vice president of global compliance and chief compliance officer. What I do not know is whether he actually reports directly to the CEO or to the general counsel. I think about 10 years ago, once upon a time, Boeing did have a more consolidated, they called it the Office of Internal Governance, which was compliance, it was audit, it was anti-fraud, and it was separate from legal, although clearly it didn't work because at that same point, that's when the MAX issues started to come around, and they disentangled and ended the Office of Internal Governance. But okay, let's still say that this falls on compliance. That could conceivably be an argument to install that CCO, CEO certification requirement, because now the CEO's fate is joined at the hip with the compliance officer for any future violations that might come to light. So maybe that would work. But I do also think that maybe they could take a cue from the banking settlements that I read about an awful lot, where all of it, even if it does fall on the audit team or the compliance team or the risk team, all of these stipulations in banking also say, and the board must have a heavy direct involvement and be briefed every quarter, or there's going to be establishment of a dedicated risk and compliance committee and things like that. And I think that's where the rubber will meet the road. I'm okay with the compliance officer having to, or the compliance function having to do a lot of the necessary lifting, but that person should have free access to the board to be able to say, do I have enough resources to actually carry all of this weight? And maybe I do, maybe I don't. Some of the resources are money, some of it is stature, some of it is access to the board or to this dedicated committee or to the CEO. And those are the sort of elements you'd need to think about for a settlement like this to work at Boeing or anyone else.
All right, Mr. Marks, how have you been thinking about the Boeing imbroglio this week?
I'll go back to sort of what I started to touch on, and that is, feedback. I keep hammering on this whole thing of feedback because, I get everybody to fall in this trap all the time. I'm like, well, let's talk about communication, right? There's a sender, there's a medium, and there's a receiver, and that's communication. And everybody nods their head, yeah, that's communication. And for those people listening, you're probably nodding your head, that's communication. And the answer to that is no, you need feedback. And, the feedback, to Matt's point, it's not that we don't have people that are speaking up. I think it's just that a lot of those sometimes people want to speak up in an anonymous way because they feel like they're infringing on somebody. I think there's probably new ways that we can use the ethics lines to create that data. I think, there's things to be gleaned from there much more than allegations of ethical failures and fraud and alleged fraud. I think it could be used. I think that's something that could be used to capture either questions for compliance in an anonymous way, or insights and maybe suggestions for improvement in controls and processes that somebody may or may not want to speak up with. I go back fundamentally, and I don't mean to be preachy, but I remember, and I still truly believe this, and I think it's a really bad idea, that when people were doing fraud risk assessments, they have these brainstorming exercises and they have everybody in the room. Everybody in the room is not going to speak up. It's just not going to happen. And it never happens. And so I always went to the one-on-one method. And I found that the information that I've got, and I did it both ways for a while just to prove my point. I found the one-on-one method was much more effective, much more laser locked and focused than, sort of this, let's have a brainstorming activity. When you say we have a speak up culture, that means that, people are going to go to their superiors or somebody who's in charge ostensibly and say to them, hey, I have an idea. Well, guess what? A lot of times that idea doesn't go anywhere. But now if you record that in a database and somebody's reading that, and now somebody's reviewing that, I think the odds of that, and again, I think a lot of this is plumbing, the odds of that getting to somebody who's going to do something about it, and the board should know about this, from a reporting perspective, are a lot greater. And I don't think it's a heavy lift. I really don't. And I think a lot of it's already in place. I just think, if we're truly going through the continuum to build a better compliance program, from ad hoc to optimized, if you're truly optimized, I think you have something like that, or you're working to something like that. And if you're not, I hate the word best practices, but maybe you're not doing what you should be doing. Maybe all those great ideas are getting lost. All those process improvement ideas are getting lost. All the betterments or enhancements to internal controls are getting lost. And, if nobody's being held accountable at the end of the day for this, it's never going to happen. So, I've heard this from all of you. Compliance is everybody's responsibility. It's not the chief compliance officer's responsibility. I mean, certainly they have their own roles and responsibilities, but that's wonderful. Responsibility is one thing, but accountability, I think that's a different story. And I think that's really where we need to start going.
Any questions, comments for Mr. Marks? All right, Mr. Armstrong, sitting across the pond as the all-knowing, all-seeing, single-eyed sage from West England. What are your sort of observations about all of this? And are there anything or things you could point to in your experience or that of the United Kingdom and the EU that we might be able to utilize to help Boeing in any of this?
I think I've got three basic themes, really. The first is, Matt's already talked about whistleblowers, and clearly something badly went wrong there. To lose whatever the phrase is, to lose one whistleblower might be bad fortune, and to lose two is pretty much a disaster in the circumstances in which both of them passed. I've read that there are around about 100 whistleblowers currently. I don't no way of verifying whether that's true or not. It seems to me 100 is better than 0, because at least you know that people are sharing concerns. But if 100 people have seen something that they care enough about to be a whistleblower, rather than speak to their line manager, rather than speak to somebody else informally in the business, speak to one of the compliance team, that's my waters tell me that's a pretty big problem. And that then has to be a full-time responsibility for people. And from my experience, people often don't handle whistleblowers well. They sort of resent the fact that they have blown the whistle, or they try and have some sort of adversarial process with them to shut them down. And I've worked on a number of investigations where we've taken a different view. Sometimes whistleblowers are well-meaning, but wrong. And I don't think there's a particular issue, as long as you can get regulators to buy in, etc., to tell them that. I have had a case where we thought the whistleblower was well-intentioned but wrong. We had permission to go and meet with them, and we explained to them what had actually happened. I've had other investigations where you say, you know, this bad thing happened. Do you think the company's learning? And they've said yes. And you say, is there any evidence of that? And I've had a number of people say to me, you're here. You know, the fact that they've picked external counsel to come and visit us and sit down with us for half a day and listen to us is an indication itself of improvement. Now, obviously, I'm self-interested in saying that external counsel sometimes has a role in this, but that's definitely is the case. You know, I've done an investigation where an internal investigation said nothing to see here, and we saw pretty horrendous evidence of misbehavior when you had an external voice that people thought was, going to listen to their concerns, maybe do something about it, but at least be more impartial. So I think having a strategy to deal with whistleblowers is really important. And I think if you've got 100, then you've probably got a problem. And I think it's a thing we just have to face. You know, we've talked before about the LRN survey on the state of compliance. If that's true, and if it's true that 25% of the Gen Z workforce admit to unethical conduct, then presumably we're going to have more incidents and more whistleblowers. And if we haven't got a program of dealing with them now, then we're going to have to. And of course, there are laws in the EU and the UK that mean that you have to be more organized in the way in which you liaise with them. So I think the C-suite and the board have got to understand these issues. And again, I get back to my point that the board will have to be suitably, have a suitable makeup to be able to supervise that effectively. My second point is slightly provocative, I guess, to American ears. What is the role of lobbying in this? Boeing apparently on public figures, I think between 2008 and 2010, paid $52 million in political donations. If some people think that Boeing have had an easier ride, is that because of the political donations? And again, being, front and center, it's perceived of the US establishment. To put that into context, the UK election has a cap per seat of £54,000. That's the maximum you can spend. Any political party is capped at £54,000 per seat. They have to submit expenses, and admittedly, they get 1 or 2 TV slots free, but we have no advertising on TV. It can't be paid for. £54,000 per seat. We have 650 seats in the UK Parliament. there's a bit of a formula, but net by my maths, the entire UK election, start to finish, soup to nuts, around the whole country, less spend than Boeing spent on lobbying in 2 years. So I think America has got a problem, and it's not just about justice being done, it's about justice being seen to be done. And if it is perceived that Boeing has an easier ride than because of its donation to political parties, then that's something that I think the US has to fix. And then the third point I'd say is this interaction between shares and compliance. It's Boeing's, made a loss partly because of these issues, and at the same time, it's almost a duopoly in many markets that Boeing operates between Boeing and Airbus. And at the same time, in the last 10 years, Airbus's shares have increased in value 154%. So you've had Boeing losing and Airbus gaining. And part of that is down to these safety issues. Part of that is down to compliance issues. And bear in mind the fact that Airbus is not the Mother Teresa of aircraft manufacturers. During that period, Airbus has also gone through a very public compliance scandal relating to bribery. And I just say it's somewhat puzzling that Rolls-Royce engines, for example, hang below the wings of Airbus planes and hang below the wings of Boeing planes. Many of the transactions that have come under scrutiny for Airbus and Rolls-Royce in their settlements also seem to have been people who've bought Boeing aircraft. And whilst we might think that there are some big issues that Boeing have, it's slightly puzzling that none of those seem to have allegedly involved bribery or FCPA. But I pass over that. But when I get back to share value, again, I get back to the board as well. It's interesting, isn't it, that, for example, the SEC are taking action against SolarWinds for failure to disclose stuff that led to a drop in share value. But there doesn't seem to be any suggestion that anybody on the Boeing board behaved badly. And I've not seen any suggestions of any sort of personal liability for any individuals here. And that seems puzzling, particularly with the focus on prosecutors all around the world to look at personal liability. It's not good enough that a corporation can pay its way out of trouble each time, either by paying politicians or by paying to settle cases to go away. And I think regulators inevitably have to concentrate on personal liability. And I'm surprised that that's not been a feature of this case. I wonder if any of you had any insight into any of that, or indeed if you wanted to defend the US pay-for-play political system in this election year. I'll remove the tongue from my cheek.
Karen, you have a question?
Are you queuing up to defend the US electoral system?
No, but Karen has a question or comment.
I am not. I find the whole lobbying, on the one hand, admirable. It's got some roles to play. On the other hand, confusing. And on the third hand, if I could have one, a little despicable, if only because there's a lot of traffic on K Street in Washington when I'm trying to cross town. But I did have a couple comments on the personal liability. So for one thing, we do have, the Caremark claim that was brought against the individual board members. That did settle, but there was individual accountability called out, at least on the part of the board in this matter. So that was, I thought, a pretty positive step. And, the DOJ has come out and said that this plea agreement relates to the corporate charges only, that it hasn't really made any kind of comment or at least public decisions as to any further prosecutions, by which I assume they mean against executives or other individuals. And I do think that there has been a very vocal part of the victims' families that may very well push the DOJ now, given the kind of slap on the wrist attitude people are seeing in this plea agreement, to follow up with some pretty high profile executive prosecutions. That's my hope, at least, because until, like I said about the school uniforms, until the DOJ kind of puts a little bit more oomph behind its stated position that it is going to be holding individuals accountable for misconduct, which we haven't seen much of, people aren't really going to believe so much. So I'm hoping that we're seeing some individual prosecutions to follow. Take their compensation. That would do it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are now moving on to our fan favorites of shout outs and rants. We're going to take the same order, but I'm going to bat fifth after Mr. Armstrong. So Karen Moore, do you have a shout out and or rant for us today?
I do, and I hope I don't take any wind, Jonathan, out of your sails, Mr. Armstrong, at least, because I've been in the UK for both the elections and the UEFA 2024 Cup. Very little going on in my corner of the world, whether it was London or up here in Cumbria on the elections. But man, oh man, my shout out to the England team, who has really pulled it out of a hat. I am not such a huge sports fan, but I will definitely be watching England-Spain on Sunday.
Go England. Mr. Kelly, you have a shout out and or rant for us?
I do have a rant, and Karen alluded to this earlier, I believe. My rant is against Tractor Supply Company and this nuttiness that happened a couple of weeks ago now, where a right-wing blogger podcaster by the name, I believe, of Bobby Starbuck, if that's his real name, I don't even know what to say there. But Mr. Starbuck started ranting about how Tractor Supply Company was a woke company, and that people, and of course by people, he means people like him who are white, conservative, Christian nationalist types, who I guess he thinks are the right-thinking people in America, and the rest of us don't count. But people should boycott Tractor Supply because it engaged in DEI programs and awareness of its carbon emissions, trying to reduce them. And Tractor Supply had actually received praise over years for working slowly, methodically to be more inclusive, be more aware of the environment. And then Starbucks shotguns this complaint across the internet. Everybody's all up in arms. Share price drops 7%. Keep that in mind, because we're going to get back to that. And so Tractor Supply almost immediately retreats. They abandoned all of their DEI efforts, cut their DEI roles, abandoned their support for gay pride events in the month of June, withdrew their carbon emissions, and all of this other stuff. They basically just folded like, you got a 4 high on your Texas Hold'em hand. It was just immediate and total collapse. And then Starbuck, the blogger, I guess he said that everything was now fine. Of course, Tractor Supply is now facing a backlash to that from all the other people in America who point out that some of their customers are in fact Black or Latino or gay or are not Christian nationalists, and they don't like this. I have so many issues with this. First off, let's just focus on the basics. Somebody makes an allegation against the company, the share price drops, and then all is good. He withdraws, he's happy, and the share price goes back up. How do we know this wasn't just a market manipulation scheme from the start? Because that's what it looks like on the outside. Somebody could have made a killing if they had known that Mr. Starbuck was going to make these kind of allegations. So I wonder about that and whether this was just a setup from the start. But secondly, when we talk about caring for stakeholder groups and the different stakeholder groups, and I get that shareholders are important, but what does this say? The CEO of Tractor Supply, Hal Lawton, what does this say about his view of employees at the company who might be minority, who might be gay, who might just not agree with the right-wing nuts who are out there attacking the company and the share price? Like, he basically said, all of you customers who are diverse, all of you employees who are diverse, anybody who values that, you are of lesser importance than the share price, which is now going to be driven, I guess, by this right-wing cuckoo-kadoo guy who is just fomenting outrage on Twitter. Is that the message he wants to send to his employees and his customers, that they're not as important as those folks? Like, what is going on? I think that CEO and Tractor Supply deserve every bit of backlash they get, because they should have stood up and said our customer base and our employees are more important than some crackpot on Twitter shotgunning around these allegations and trying to manipulate the share price. Maybe it's just a sad spectacle, and it never should have happened.
Mr. Barks, do you have a shout out and or rant for us today?
Actually, I had a couple of them, but I think you all took them, so I'll kind of pile on a little bit here. But I guess, when it comes to safety, I know that we've spoken about Marshan and Bluebell and some of the other cases and some of the commonalities there related to safety and how they link to overall compliance, or the general theme there about overall compliance. I guess my rant really is, if I had to unpack and repack the whole thing, is, I just don't think that organizations understand corporate governance. I really don't. I think there's a lot of talk about it. I think, people attend classes and they think they understand it. But, when you start to talk about the components of a governance framework, business practices and ethics and disclosure and transparency and enterprise risk management and communication and things like that, and you ask people to provide, some context behind it, you get nothing. It's almost like, I can't remember who mentioned, Boeing's 3 core values. I think it might have been Karen. Now, I'd be interested if you walked around Boeing and said, okay, fine, you name them, but what do they mean? It's kind of like when I go back, and Matt can attest to this, is I ask, what does internal controls mean? And so, I think we say a lot of things, and, we've talked about for years that compliance programs can't be a paper tiger and that we need to document things. That's wonderful. But I think we need to go back and make sure that the people that are supposed to be held accountable really and truly understand the depth and breadth of the organization. And not only can they spout off the core values or spout off the components of a governance framework, but they actually understand what it means, and how these parts and pieces all come into play when you're building out a culture of compliance. Because I don't think a lot of people do. So my rant really is, I'm going back to the board and I'm saying, I don't think board members really understand corporate compliance. Prove me wrong.
Mr. Armstrong.
Yeah, I've had an embarrassment of riches this week. As Karen said, the football, by the way, it's correctly called football, not soccer, has been great news for England. The cricket, a historic victory over the West Indies this morning. The retirement of possibly the greatest bowler ever in cricket, Jimmy Anderson, this morning as well. But I'm going to shout out to Sir Keir Starmer. I think a historic victory for the Labour Party. The most corrupt government in my lifetime has gone. And I think there's a good news story. I mean, obviously, I'm slightly partial. As many of you know, I went to the same university as Sir Keir. He's just ahead of me. We had some of the same tutors. I have met him. I have chatted to him. I wouldn't say we're friends, but I think I'm impartial in that I think it's a good news story for the country. He obviously went to a state grammar school. This isn't the hallowed halls of Eton or Harrow, where we've recruited prime ministers from of late. We're trying something different. He's somebody who has had a career as a public servant. He spent 5 years as the director of public prosecution, a task that is the envy of nobody, I think. So he's done the hard yards as a public servant, and now he's got the chance to be the chief public servant of all. So I think it bodes well. It's a first week. We're a week in. Obviously, Tom and I have done a podcast with much more detail on what the election might mean. It's not without its challenges. The Labour Party is divided. There are still some nutty people. I know Mrs. Fox, I think, called me a left-wing nutcase or something. But there are people, certainly more left-wing than me, that remain in the Labour Party. But early days, and certainly a splendid victory, and certainly a very dignified campaign. Certainly, spoiler alert, by the standards of what you're about to get this year.
All right. Well, I'm going to go in a little bit different direction, but with a similar theme. I'm going to have a sports theme, and I'm going to shout out to Paul Skeens. Who is Paul Skeens? He is a rookie pitcher for the Pittsburgh Pirates who, through 11 starts in 2024, has a win-loss record of 6-0, a 1.9 ERA. He's thrown 66 innings with 89 strikeouts. He has two outings, where he hasn't allowed a hit, although his manager will not let him complete the game, so he does not have a no-hitter. And he is the first rookie pitcher in 28 years to be named as the starter for the All-Star game. So for those of us who haven't had the chance to see Paul Skeens yet, he will be starting in the All-Star game for the National League. Frankly, I can't wait. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a great episode. Thanks, everyone. And I can't wait to see what we come up with collectively next time.